sparing some time to take us through how you envisage the future might well be. As you can see, Frank joins us from TCS, Managing Director and also futurist. So I'm delighted to welcome to the stage Frank.
Well, good morning. So as mentioned, I'm a futurist, which means I get to spend all of my time thinking about where the world is going, and I want to share some of that with you this morning. First, I wanted to start with how much I like the phrase freedom to create. And I think when I'm done, you'll understand why. And I also want to pick up on something I heard in that opening, which was the speed at which ideas get turned into reality. And again, as I get through this presentation, you'll see that it's never been more important for us to be able to do exactly that. So let me start with that quote, which talks about the past. Interesting as a futurist to be thinking about the past, but as Winston Churchill told us, we learn an awful lot by looking backwards before we look forward. And so I'm going to spend the first part of this looking at history and trying to assess exactly what history tells us about the future. And then we'll spend some time thinking about possible futures. So sit back, relax, and take this journey back into history with me. And the first question then is, what does history actually tell us about the future? And as I pondered that question, I landed on a specific point in history that I found very instructive. And that point was a 100-year period, which some call a special century, from 1870 to 1970, where the standard of living of our world changed considerably for the first time ever. Everything that happened prior to that period really were fits and starts as far as improving our well-being. We'd move forward and then move back again. They just never really were able to improve the standard of living until this point in time. And that innovation wheel that you see there was my attempt to capture why. What happened in that 100-year period to do exactly that. And as you can see, a series of inventions really moves us ahead, as well as human action, which is critical to this conversation. So an innovation wheel that elevates the standard of living in most of the globe represents this 100-year period. But then the question became, so why? What enabled this 100-year period to be so special? And as I probed that question, the signals for the future started to manifest themselves. The first really being great invention. So this period represents the biggest period of invention the world's ever known. And as I go through this, I'm going to make the case that we're likely to surpass that period. But ingredient one, great invention. Ingredient two was a level of convergence across multiple domains that had never happened before. Humans acting across these domains in ways that moved us forward. And again, very difficult for humans to be able to do that kind of thing. And then the third, because it is difficult for humans to do this, were catalysts. Things that drove us to action, which is really a great learning in terms of how to think about what's coming. Those catalysts, however, were not pleasant. World War I was the first big catalyst. The second being the Great Depression. And then the third and biggest one, really World War II. And while all this was happening, there was something incredible happening, and that was the democratization of invention and innovation, which allowed the global society to benefit from all that invention. And that's an important point as we think about the future as well. So three things: great invention, convergence, and catalysts. But those catalysts were fermented in a very troubling time. As you look at this visual, I want you to focus on the characteristics of that era, and then think about how many of those exist today. Because I don't think you'll find one on the list that doesn't exist today. So those really horrible catalysts were fermented in a period that looks similar to this current era. And I've been talking about this for 6 or 7 years, but the world is starting to talk about it a lot in quotes, in books. This book, The Raging 2020s, focuses exactly on this point, that in the 1930s something was happening that dramatically changed the world. And the point being that the 2020 period looks an awful lot like the 1920s, and something dramatic is likely to happen. There are a number of signals, not to be dramatic, a number of signals that are forming to tell us that that quote is probably spot on as we look at the world around us. But the building blocks that form that era, and this is a key point as we think about the future building blocks, were these. You can see similarities here as well. Great invention, immigration issues, tariff wars, financial stress, antitrust activity and actions. I can go on and on. Really a series of building blocks that again look very similar to today's world. but it was one small segment of a much broader story. And this story, and I know it's hard to see the visual, but it's a canvas that represents all the things that happened in that 100-year period across these domains that really formed our current world. So fascinating to think about what happened. If we lived in that time, we never would have predicted this. Hindsight helps us an awful lot. And so that's a key point as well. Prediction is impossible. But it does give us a frame for thinking about the future. So this framework, in terms of building blocks across domains, I'm going to come back to, because it really is really instructive as to where the world may be going. So with that, we think about signals. What did we learn in that quick, brief walk through history? The first thing that's really informational for us is that across history, we like to stick to things that worked. Very difficult for us to change our frame of reference, our thinking. And this quote says it really well. We as humans resist change. We resist change even if the signals around us are begging us to change. But something about us is really interesting. When we're forced to change, we as a society, as humanity, do it really well. We're very versatile. It just takes catalysts, as I said before, to force us into action. So that's part of the story in terms of history and information. But the signals themselves are instructive. The first is that period of great invention. And I maintain that the world has entered the next period of great invention and likely to be the biggest ever if things play out the way they seem. This platform for society, every time three pieces have changed, energy, communications, and transport, the world is transformed. And clearly, as we look at the platform for society, we can see things changing across the platform. So great invention, check. One piece of the ingredient is there. The second is convergence, which, as I mentioned, is the most difficult thing for humans to do across multiple domains. But we're starting to see convergence again, specifically in the area of science and technology. Does it need help? Science and technology is converging on its own, one fueling the other. And as it does so, the rapid pace of our society is accelerating, back to that notion of innovation and speed. But it's complex because we have two other pieces to the puzzle. One is the environment. As we know, lots of discussion on the environment that's going to continue. But philosophy as an interesting add as we think about where automation is heading. And the notion for morals and ethics to be part of the conversation. It's just interesting to see now two more pieces of the convergence story. So the challenge for leaders around the world is to understand the path of convergence. And it's through that understanding that we'll have snapshots of where the world may head. So we'll come back to some of that. But the third piece, ingredient, is the catalyst. So what are the catalysts that are likely to spur us forward? We see two so far: purpose and the orientation of leaders around the world around purpose, which is no longer just window dressing. It's happening everywhere. Leaders around the world are focused on societal good, on climate change, on all kinds of purpose-driven themes. And the second, obviously, is COVID-19 itself, as it plays a role in accelerating the pace of what might have happened anyway, but is happening on a faster timeline. So two specific catalysts. But those are only two. So 3.5 years ago, I asked the question of a fairly large audience what they felt the catalysts of change would be. And you can see from the responses on this list what they thought. So interesting, the pace of innovation itself being the #1 catalyst that people felt would drive us forward. But other things like geopolitical instability, societal unrest, etc. After the pandemic, I thought maybe things would change. The perspective that we've all seen change in terms of how we think about work and education, etc., has changed. Would people's perspective on catalysts change? So I asked the question again, and you can see that indeed there were some changes. Climate change made it to the top. Not surprisingly, societal unrest made it up to #2 because think back, this was June of 2020, what was happening around the world as far as protests and other phenomena. So not surprising, but a couple new additions. A new world order, driven primarily by the China phenomena and the deglobalization discussions that were happening back then because of the pandemic, and deglobalization itself. Who knows where that all goes, but two additions to the list. And then really interesting and really speaks to why things are moving so fast. If I ask this question again, I guarantee you that fear of nuclear war would add back onto the list and probably would be higher on that list. So just another ingredient in terms of the pace of change. This all tells us that our challenge as leaders is to rehearse the future and understand the possibilities, which is really what I'm attempting to do as I talk to leaders around the world. So to experiment, you ask questions. So this question, I'd like you to ponder your answer to this question as I go through it. Will artificial intelligence be more profound and impactful than even fire, the internet, and electricity? So how would you answer that question, which is a form of rehearsing, right? These are signals that tell us how people are thinking about this. When I asked the question of a broad audience, you can see how everyone responded. About 500 respondents, 43% said yes, it will. With, as you can see from the numbers, others thinking differently. But what gets interesting is breaking this down. Business executives, C-suite board members, had this to say. 42% believe AI will be more profound than those great inventions of the past. Business professionals, everybody in the business community, had a lesser view, as you can see split on the topic. And then technology professionals, maybe because closer to AI and its capabilities, a little less in terms of the positive response. But innovation professionals, this happens to be a very large auto manufacturer in their innovation organization, really thought AI was going to be significant. And then, interesting for me anyway, foresight professionals, not so positive. This was just a form of rehearsal, right? Thinking about how these things may play out. Just other signals that we can use as we think about where the future may go. And this specific quote from a really good book just released, the Genesis Machine about synthetic biology, one of those big changes that are coming. I love the quote, specifically the piece that says, if we don't ask those what-if questions, we're going to deal with what-now questions. I really love the way she positions that in her book. And so to think about the what-if, we need a framework. So I go back to that period of 1870 to 1970 and that canvas I showed. The question for us is, what does the canvas of the future look like? How would we fill in these building blocks as a way to think about where the world is heading? Realizing that it's very complex, systems thinking is very critical here, and also realizing that the world is in the midst of a phase transition. The first time in a long time that we are shifting from one era to another. And going back to why I think the notion of freedom to create is so important, we're moving from an age of extraction to the age of creation, which I'll come back to as I close. But when I thought about this, the question became, how do I create an eye test for you, which is basically this series of building blocks across those domains that help us to think about what might come next. So to make it a little bit more digestible for you, we'll start with assessing each of the domains. First and foremost, science and technology. What are the building blocks and how do they shape the world? So a couple to start with. Robotics. Clearly, the pandemic has accelerated the pace of robotics. And as we think about what's happening, it's not just about the warehouses